The judge had already started writing the decision when the number didn't make sense. It was a small number, almost invisible, buried in the middle of a financial disclosure form that looked as clean and polished as the man who submitted it. Most people in the courtroom had stopped paying attention. The husband's lawyer looked relaxed. The husband himself looked calm, almost bored, as if the outcome had already been decided long before the hearing began. But Judge Rebecca Langley stopped writing. She leaned back slightly in her chair and stared at one line in the document. Total liquid assets, $214,300. She looked up slowly. Across the courtroom, Ethan Caldwell sat beside his attorney in a tailored navy suit, his posture controlled, his expression measured. He had the face of a man who knew how to win quietly. His hair was perfectly styled, his cufflinks subtle but expensive. He didn't look nervous. He didn't need to. On the other side sat his wife, Maria Caldwell. Maria looked smaller than she had 10 years ago when they first stood in front of a judge. Different judge, different promises. She wore a simple cream blouse and dark slacks. No jewelry, no makeup beyond the bare minimum. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, knuckles pale. To an outsider, she looked defeated. Maybe she was. Her attorney, Daniel Hayes, shuffled through a thin stack of papers, clearly outmatched by the thick binders Ethan's legal team had prepared. Judge Langley looked at Ethan again. "Mr. Caldwell," she said evenly, "you've declared that your total accessible liquid assets amount to $214,300. "Yes, Your Honor," Ethan replied smoothly. "And this includes all accounts under your name, business and personal?" "Yes." Maria's chest tightened. She had heard this number so many times over the past 6 months. It had become a weapon, a wall. Every time she questioned it, Ethan would sigh and say she didn't understand how business worked. Judge Langley glanced down at the page again. "Your Honor," Ethan's lawyer interrupted gently, "we've provided full disclosures in compliance with court requirements. There's no evidence of concealment." The judge nodded slightly but didn't look convinced. Maria felt her heart pounding. This was the moment she had feared and hoped for. If the judge accepted the numbers, everything would be settled. Ethan would walk away with the company, the house, most of the investments. Maria would receive a modest settlement and a polite reminder that she had not been financially contributing. The courtroom was quiet, too quiet. Judge Langley tapped her pen lightly against the paper. "Mr. Caldwell," she said slowly, "your company reported quarterly profits exceeding 6 figures last year." Ethan smiled politely. "Yes, Your Honor, but profits do not equal liquid assets." "Of course," the judge replied. Maria closed her eyes for a second. She could feel it slipping away. Then Judge Langley asked a question no one expected. "When did you close the Pacific Horizon account?" The air shifted. Ethan blinked. "I'm sorry. The Pacific Horizon account," the judge repeated. "When was it closed?" Maria's head snapped up. Ethan's lawyer stiffened. "Your Honor, that account was consolidated years ago." Judge Langley tilted her head slightly. "That's not what the preliminary tax review suggests." Ethan felt something cold move through his chest. Maria's breathing became shallow. The judge continued calmly. "I see a withdrawal from that account 3 weeks before this filing. A substantial withdrawal." Ethan swallowed. "That was an internal transfer." "To where?" the judge asked. Silence. Maria stared at Ethan. She had asked him about that account once. He had told her it no longer existed. Ethan cleared his throat. It was reallocated into operational expenses. Judge Langley's eyes didn't leave his face. Operational expenses that do not appear in this disclosure. The courtroom felt smaller, hotter. Ethan's lawyer stood quickly. "Your Honor, if there's confusion we can clarify in writing." "I don't want clarification," Judge Langley said. "I want records." Maria's heart slammed against her ribs. The judge looked down at the documents again, then back up at Ethan. "Mr. Caldwell, this court relies on full transparency. If there are accounts not reflected here, intentionally or otherwise, I will require complete bank records." Ethan's calm expression cracked for half a second. "That won't be necessary," his lawyer said firmly. "We've complied." Judge Langley leaned forward. "I'm ordering a full financial review," she said, "including the Pacific Horizon account and any affiliated transfers. Court will reconvene after submission." The gavel came down. Maria felt the sound in her bones. Ethan turned toward his lawyer, whispering urgently, but Maria couldn't hear the words. She didn't need to. For the first time in months, the numbers weren't protecting him. For the first time, the court was asking for proof. As people began to stand, Ethan looked across the aisle at Maria. There was something new in his eyes, not anger, not confidence, fear, because he knew something the courtroom didn't yet know. The Pacific Horizon account hadn't been consolidated. It had been moved, and if the court saw where it had gone, everything would collapse. Ethan Caldwell had built his entire strategy around one assumption: if the numbers looked clean, no one would look twice. Now someone had. The hallway outside Courtroom 4B buzzed with muted conversation, but Ethan barely heard it. His lawyer, Richard Palmer, pulled him toward a quiet corner near the elevators. "You told me that account was closed," Richard said in a tight whisper. "It was handled," Ethan snapped back. "There's a difference." Richard stared at him. "That's not an answer." Ethan ran a hand through his hair. "It was moved into a holding structure. Temporary. Temporary for what? For protection." Richard exhaled sharply. "Protection from whom?" Ethan didn't answer. Across the hallway, Maria stood near a window, her attorney beside her. The city looked distant and indifferent below. Cars moved, people crossed streets. Life went on as if nothing was unraveling upstairs. "Did you know about that account?" Daniel asked her quietly. Maria nodded. "He used to mention it years ago. Then one day he said it was gone. And you believed him?" She hesitated. "I wanted to." Daniel studied her face. "If the judge orders full records, this changes everything." Maria's stomach twisted. Everything. The word was too big, too heavy. Back inside the courtroom, Judge Langley remained seated for a moment after everyone left. She flipped through the disclosure again, tapping the Pacific Horizon reference with her pen. She had seen this pattern before. Not dramatic fraud, not obvious deception. Just slight adjustments, strategic timing. Money that moved just before scrutiny intensified. The next hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later. 2 weeks. For Ethan, those 14 days felt like a ticking clock. The moment he returned to his office, he shut the door and pulled out his phone. "Is everything clean?" he asked as soon as the call connected. The voice on the other end was calm. It was before the court order. Ethan's jaw tightened. "Can they trace it?" "Depends how deep they dig." "How deep do you think they'll dig?" "Silence. That depends on how nervous you look." Ethan ended the call and leaned back in his chair. His office, once a symbol of success, now felt like a glass box, transparent, vulnerable. Meanwhile, Maria sat at her kitchen table, staring at old bank statements she had saved without knowing why. Small inconsistencies. Transfers she had asked about and been dismissed over. "You're overthinking," Ethan had told her. "You don't understand how these structures work." She remembered every word. The night before the reconvened hearing, Maria couldn't sleep. She replayed every moment of their marriage where she had felt something wasn't right, but stayed quiet. Anyway, the promotions, the sudden investments, the account he claimed no longer existed. What if she had spoken sooner? What if she hadn't believed him? Morning arrived heavy and grey. The courtroom was fuller this time. Word had spread quietly among attorneys and observers. A judge ordering records mid-proceeding was not routine. Ethan sat straighter than before, but the edge of tension was visible now. Richard Palmer's briefcase looked thicker. More documents, more explanations. Judge Langley entered without ceremony. "Mr. Caldwell," she began, "have you submitted the requested records?" Richard stood. "Yes, Your Honor. Full statements from the Pacific Horizon account and related transfers." The clerk handed the documents to the judge. Maria felt her pulse in her ears. Judge Langley began reviewing. Minutes passed, then 5, then 10. The courtroom was silent except for the soft rustle of paper. Ethan kept his face neutral. He had rehearsed this. The transfers were structured, layered, justifiable, technically. Judge Langley stopped turning pages. She looked up slowly. "Mr. Caldwell," she said evenly, "can you explain why $380,000 was transferred from Pacific Horizon into a private LLC 10 days before you filed for divorce?" The air cracked. Maria felt her breath leave her body. Ethan's throat went dry. That LLC manages consulting operations that are not disclosed anywhere in this filing. Richard stepped in quickly. "Your Honor, that entity is separate from marital assets. It was funded during the marriage," the judge replied. Silence. Maria's fingers dug into the edge of the tea. "Abel," Judge Langley continued calmly, "and this LLC appears to have no active contracts, no payroll, no operating expenses." Ethan's heartbeat thundered. "It looks," the judge said carefully, "like a holding account." The word echoed. Holding. Maria stared at Ethan. "You moved the money," she whispered, barely audible. Ethan didn't look at her. Judge Langley closed the file gently. "This court does not appreciate partial transparency," she said. Richard's voice was tight. "Your Honor, there is no evidence of intent to conceal." The judge's gaze sharpened. "Intent," she said softly, "is often revealed by timing." Maria felt something inside her shift. The detail that had seemed small was becoming a doorway. And behind it, there was more. The word holding account hung in the courtroom like smoke that refused to clear. Ethan Caldwell felt the temperature drop around him. $380,000. The number sounded louder now that it had been spoken aloud. He had counted on technical language to soften it. LLC, reallocation, consulting structure. All the phrases that made money look like paperwork instead of movement. But Judge Langley wasn't looking at paperwork. She was looking at timing. "Mr. Caldwell," she said evenly, "why was this entity created 12 days before the divorce filing?" Ethan forced himself to speak calmly. "It was a restructuring decision. We had discussed diversifying operations." "With whom?" the judge asked. "With advisors." "Which advisors?" Ethan hesitated. Richard stepped forward quickly. "Your Honor, we can provide documentation." "Answer the question," the judge said firmly. Ethan swallowed. "It was internal." Maria watched him, her chest tightening. Internal. The same word he had used whenever she had asked about something that didn't feel right. Internal meant private. Private meant untouchable. Untouchable meant hidden. Judge Langley tapped the document again. "This LLC has no employees, no clients, no operating expenses, yet it received nearly $400,000. "It was future planning," Ethan insisted. "For what future?" the judge asked quietly. The silence stretched. Maria felt heat rise in her face. For years she had questioned small things and been told she was imagining problems. Now the questions were no longer hers. They belonged to the court. Judge Langley leaned back slightly. "Mr. Caldwell, the court needs to determine whether this was an effort to shield marital assets." "It wasn't," Ethan replied immediately. Maria flinched at how quickly he said it. The judge glanced at another page. "There is also a second transfer." Ethan's heart stopped. "A second transfer of $120,000, she continued. "Made 5 days later." Maria's head snapped toward him. "You said there was nothing," she whispered. Ethan didn't respond. Richard cleared his throat. "Your Honor, these are business reallocations." "Business reallocations," the judge repeated calmly, "made immediately prior to filing for divorce." The pattern was no longer subtle. The courtroom felt suffocating. Maria's breathing grew shallow. She remembered the week before he filed, the way he had been unusually distant, working late, phone locked more often than usual. She had assumed he was stressed. He had been moving money. Judge Langley looked directly at Ethan. "Did you inform your wife about these transfers?" "No," he admitted. "Why not?" It wasn't necessary. Maria felt something break inside her. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet fracture of whatever hope had remained. Judge Langley's voice softened slightly, but her eyes did not. In divorce proceedings, full financial disclosure is not optional. Richard stepped forward again. Your Honor, even if the timing appears unfortunate, there is no direct proof of concealment. The judge nodded slowly. Perhaps not yet, she said. The words landed heavily. Maria felt her pulse pounding in her ears. Judge Langley closed the folder carefully. This court is expanding the financial review to include all affiliated entities under Mr. Caldwell's control, she said. Additionally, I am ordering a forensic audit of the LLC. Ethan's composure cracked visibly. Your Honor, he began, his voice tighter now. This is unnecessary. Judge Langley met his gaze. Then you should have nothing to worry about. The gavel struck. The sound felt final, even though nothing was decided yet. Outside the courtroom, Maria leaned against the wall, her legs weak. Daniel stood beside her, saying something about process and timelines, but she barely heard him. She could only think about one thing. If he moved that much money so easily, what else had he moved? Down the hallway, Ethan grabbed Richard's arm. This is getting out of control, he hissed. It's already out of control, Richard replied quietly. Can they trace everything? Richard looked at him carefully. If there's more, now is the time to tell me. Ethan's jaw tightened. There was more. And if the court found it, the divorce wouldn't just be about division. It would be about deception. Back inside the empty courtroom, Judge Langley sat alone for a moment after everyone left. She had seen this before. Men who believed intelligence meant invisibility. Men who underestimated details. Men who forgot that timing tells its own story. She glanced at the line again. Pacific Horizon. What had started as one small discrepancy was now unfolding into something larger. And she had a feeling. This wasn't the end of the numbers. It was the beginning. The forensic audit began quietly, without headlines or spectacle. But inside Ethan Caldwell's world, it detonated like a silent explosion. 2 days after the judge's order, a formal notice arrived at his office requesting complete access to financial records. Personal, corporate, affiliated entities, digital ledgers, archived transactions. Not summaries, not spreadsheets prepared by his own accountants. Raw data. Ethan read the notice twice before placing it down slowly on his desk. They're overreaching, he muttered. Richard Palmer didn't look convinced. They're digging. Ethan paced his office, every movement tight. There's nothing illegal. That's not the only standard anymore, Richard replied. Now it's about intent. Intent. The word felt heavier than fraud. Across town, Maria sat with Daniel Hayes reviewing the audit order. Her hands were steady now. Not because she felt strong, but because something inside her had already broken beyond fear. They'll see everything? She asked. If it's there, Daniel said. Maria thought about the years she had second-guessed herself. The subtlety, dismissals. The quiet financial decisions she was told not to worry about. She had spent a decade believing she lacked understanding. Now the court was asking the same questions she once whispered. The audit team moved fast. They requested server access logs, historical transaction trails, communication records between Ethan and the private LLC's registered agent. The deeper they went, the more patterns surfaced. Transfers layered through secondary accounts, short-term placements, funds that left and returned, all technically structured, all strategically timed. One afternoon, Ethan received a call from his financial advisor. They flagged the Meridian Capital pathway. Ethan's grip tightened around the phone. How? The LLC wired funds into Meridian, then back through a consulting invoice. That's standard restructuring, not when there's no consulting contract. Ethan's silence was answer enough. Meanwhile, Maria received an unexpected email from the audit team requesting clarification on something called Meridian Capital. She didn't recognize the name. But she recognized the date. It was the same week Ethan told her they needed to tighten spending. The hearing reconvened, sooner than expected. The courtroom felt heavier now, tighter, as if everyone present understood this was no longer a routine divorce dispute. Judge Rebecca Langley entered with a thicker file than before. "Mr. Caldwell," she began without delay, "the forensic review has uncovered additional undisclosed financial channels." Ethan felt his pulse spike. "Specifically," she continued, "a sequence involving Meridian Capital and subsequent invoice routing." Richard stood immediately. "Your Honor, these are legitimate restructuring mechanisms." "Mechanisms that were not disclosed," the judge replied. Ethan swallowed. Maria stared at the table in front of her. The wood grain blurred as her vision trembled. Judge Langley continued calmly. "The court has identified over $500,000 moved through these pathways in the months preceding the divorce filing." The number hit Maria like a physical force. $500,000. "You said we were tight," she whispered without meaning to. Ethan didn't look at her. Richard's voice was firm but strained. "Your Honor, there is no evidence these funds were permanently removed from marital consideration." Judge Langley's eyes sharpened. "But there is evidence they were temporarily concealed." Silence. Ethan felt the walls closing in. He had counted on complexity to protect him. Layer enough transactions, create enough structures, hide behind technical legitimacy. But now, the complexity was turning against him. Judge Langley leaned forward. "Mr. Caldwell, I am giving you an opportunity to explain these movements fully and truthfully." Ethan's mind raced. If he admitted intent, he risked penalties. If he denied it, the audit trail would contradict him. His voice came out lower than he expected. It was precautionary. Precaution against what? The judge asked. Ethan hesitated. Maria's chest tightened painfully. "Against losing everything," he said. The words hung in the air. Judge Langley didn't blink. "You were not at risk of losing everything," she said evenly. "You were at risk of equitable division." Ethan's jaw clenched. Maria felt tears burn behind her eyes, not from sadness, but from clarity. For years, she had thought his fear was about survival. It was about control. Judge Langley closed the folder gently. "This court takes financial transparency seriously," she said. "The audit will continue. If further concealment is identified, the consequences will escalate." The gavel struck. The sound felt like a countdown. Outside the courtroom, Maria leaned against the cold marble wall. $500,000. Moved. Hidden. Rerouted. She thought about the night she clipped grocery coupons, the arguments about budget discipline, the vacations postponed, the things she believed they couldn't afford. Ethan passed her in the hallway, but she didn't look up. For the first time, she wasn't afraid of what the court might find. She was afraid of how much she had never known. And somewhere deep inside Ethan's mind, a realization began forming. If the audit team kept pulling threads, they might find the one transfer he never intended anyone to see. The one transfer he never intended anyone to see had been buried deeper than the others. Ethan Caldwell had convinced himself it was untouchable. It wasn't routed through Pacific Horizon. It didn't pass through Meridian Capital. It didn't sit inside the consulting LLC. It had been executed quietly, late at night, from a device that wasn't registered to his office network. He had called it a contingency. Now it felt like a ticking bomb. 3 days after the last hearing, Richard Palmer called him with a voice that sounded thinner than usual. "They've requested offshore disclosure." Ethan stopped breathing for a second. "Offshore?" he repeated carefully. "Yes," Richard said. "Specifically any holdings tied to Cayman or Belize-based entities." Ethan stared at the skyline outside his window. The glass reflected his own face back at him, pale, strained, older than it had looked a month ago. How would they even? Meridian flagged a routing anomaly, Richard interrupted. The audit team followed the chain. Ethan sat down slowly. The Cayman structure wasn't large compared to everything else. $260,000. But it was pure, untouched, unshared, invisible, or it had been. Across town, Maria received another update from Daniel. "They're expanding internationally," he said. Maria felt her heart skip. Internationally? Yes. The audit trail suggests funds exited domestic accounts. She stared at him. "How much? We don't know yet." The uncertainty was worse than the numbers. That night, Maria couldn't sleep again. She lay in the dark, replaying moments that now felt scripted. The night Ethan insisted on a separate laptop for client privacy. The sudden business trip that had seemed unnecessary. The password changes. She had thought she was paranoid. Now she wondered how much she had been protected from. The next hearing felt electric before it even began. The courtroom was quieter than usual, but the tension was sharp enough to cut through air. Judge Rebecca Langley entered with a sealed envelope in her hand. Ethan noticed it immediately. "Mr. Caldwell," she began, "the forensic audit has uncovered an offshore entity registered under a trust structure linked to your identification credentials." Ethan's throat went dry. Richard stood quickly. "Your Honor, we have not yet reviewed the full documentatio." "You will," the judge replied calmly, "but I have." Maria's hands trembled. $260,000 was transferred from Meridian Capital into this offshore trust 5 days before divorce filing. The room went silent. Maria felt like the floor disappeared beneath her. Ethan forced himself to speak. It was a temporary safeguard. "Safeguard against what?" the judge asked again. He hesitated. The same question, the same silence. "Against instability," he said finally. Judge Langley's gaze hardened. "Instability created by divorce proceedings." Ethan didn't respond. Maria's voice came out barely above a whisper. "You said we didn't have savings." The words weren't meant for the court. They were meant for him. Ethan didn't look at her. Judge Langley opened the envelope and removed several pages. "This offshore trust was not disclosed in your financial affidavit. It wasn't active income," Richard argued. "It was active concealment," the judge corrected. The words echoed through the room. Maria felt something shift inside her. Not shock anymore. Not disbelief. Recognition. This wasn't about misunderstanding business. This was about deliberate removal. Judge Langley leaned forward. "Mr. Caldwell, do you understand the seriousness of non-disclosure in family court?" "Yes, Your Honor. And yet you continued moving funds after initial scrutiny." Ethan's composure finally cracked. "I didn't want to lose everything," he said, louder now. "I built that company. I carried the risk." Maria stood suddenly. "And I carried you," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "For 10 years. The courtroom froze. Judge Langley allowed the moment. Ethan's breathing was heavy now. He hadn't expected her to speak. He hadn't expected this to go so far. Judge Langley closed the envelope carefully. "This court is now considering punitive measures," she said, "including asset redistribution beyond standard equitable division." Richard's face drained of color. Maria felt her pulse pounding, but she didn't look away from Ethan this time. For years he had controlled the narrative. Now the numbers were telling it for him. Judge Langley raised her gavel slightly. "The audit will conclude within 72 hours. If further concealment is identified, I will not hesitate to impose maximum sanctions." The gavel struck. Outside the courtroom, Ethan leaned against the wall, his world narrowing. There was still one final transaction, one that connected the offshore trust to something older, something predating even Pacific Horizon. If they found that, this would no longer be just a divorce case. It would become something else entirely. The 72 hours felt like a countdown to something irreversible. Ethan Caldwell barely left his office. Every call from Richard Palmer made his chest tighten. Every email notification felt like a warning siren. He had built his life on calculated risk, on knowing how far he could stretch before something snapped. Now he wasn't sure where the breaking point was. The final transaction wasn't recent. That was the problem. It predated Pacific Horizon, predated Meridian, predated even the consulting LLC. It was older, cleaner, buried. 6 years ago, during a year of rapid expansion, Ethan had created a silent revenue diversion within the company's internal billing structure. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't obvious. A fractional percentage skimmed from contract escalations and redirected through layered vendor agreements. At the time, he told himself it was compensation for unrecognized effort, a reward he had earned. It had grown quietly. He never expected it to matter. Now the forensic audit team was asking for archived vendor contracts from that exact year. Across town, Maria felt something heavy in her chest she couldn't explain. It wasn't fear anymore. It was anticipation. Daniel had called her earlier that afternoon. "They're reviewing historical vendor pathways," he said carefully. "Why?" she asked. "There's an inconsistency." The word made her stomach drop. Ethan had always been meticulous, controlled, strategic. If something was inconsistent, it meant he hadn't planned for it. The courtroom reconvened with an intensity that felt final. Judge Rebecca Langley entered with a stack of documents thicker than any before. Her face revealed nothing. "Mr. Caldwell," she began, "the audit has identified a revenue diversion mechanism dating back 6 years. Ethan felt the blood drain from his face. Richard stood immediately. "Your Honor, we request clarification." "You will have it," the judge said calmly. She lifted a page. Vendor escalation percentages were adjusted incrementally across 5 contracts. The adjusted amount was routed through a third-party vendor entity and subsequently into accounts linked to your control. The air felt like it disappeared. Maria's hands covered her mouth. "This amounts," Judge Langley continued evenly, "to over $700,000 accumulated over 6 years. The Bear echoed. 700,000. Ethan's vision blurred for a moment. It was performance-based compensation, he tried to argue. Compensation not reflected in corporate disclosures, the judge replied. "It wasn't marital income," Richard added quickly. "It was earned during the marriage," Judge Langley said. Maria stared at Ethan as if seeing him for the first time. "You said the company was struggling," she whispered. Ethan couldn't look at her. Judge Langley leaned forward slightly. "This court is no longer examining isolated transfers," she said. "We are examining a pattern of financial manipulation designed to shield assets from equitable division." Ethan's heart pounded violently. "It wasn't manipulation," he insisted weakly. "Then what was it?" the judge asked. He had no answer. Maria felt tears streaming down her face, but she didn't wipe them away. For years she had doubted her instincts. Now the truth was unfolding in front of everyone. Judge Langley closed the file slowly. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, her voice measured but firm, "this case has evolved beyond simple non-disclosure." Ethan felt the weight of those words press against his chest. "This court will consider not only full redistribution of assets," she continued, "but also referral for further investigation." The courtroom froze. Referral. The word carried implications far beyond divorce. Richard's voice cracked slightly. "Your Honor, we request leniency." "Leniency," Judge Langley interrupted, "requires transparency." Silence swallowed the room. Maria felt a strange calm settle over her. This was no longer about winning. It was about exposure. Judge Langley lifted gavel. "The final ruling will be delivered at the next session. All parties are advised to prepare accordingly." The gavel struck. Ethan sat motionless. $700,000, 6 years, hidden in plain sight. As he stood to leave, Maria didn't move. He walked past her without speaking, for the first time in his life. Ethan Caldwell wasn't calculating. He was cornered. And somewhere in the documents still under review, there was a digital timestamp, one he had forgotten to erase. The digital timestamp was the kind of detail Ethan Caldwell once trusted to stay invisible. It wasn't a transfer. It wasn't a wire. It wasn't even a dollar amount. It was a login, a late-night login from 6 years ago, 3 minutes before the vendor escalation percentages were modified. The forensic team almost missed it. Almost. But when they traced the revenue diversion mechanism back to its origin point, they found the metadata attached to the adjustment entry. The system had recorded the device ID, the IP trace, and the authorization credentials used to approve the vendor change. It led directly to Ethan's personal executive login, not the corporate shared credentials, not a delegated authority. Him. The final hearing arrived under a silence so heavy it felt deliberate. No whispers in the gallery. No casual conversations between attorneys. Even Richard Palmer's usual composure looked brittle. Judge Rebecca Langley entered the courtroom carrying a single file. Thin. That was what unsettled Ethan the most. Thin meant clarity. "Mr. Caldwell," she began, her voice steady. "The court has completed review of the forensic audit." Ethan didn't move. The financial transfers, both domestic and offshore, demonstrate a pattern of concealment. Richard shifted slightly, preparing to respond, but Judge Langley continued before he could speak. "However, what concerns this court most is the revenue diversion mechanism identified 6 years prior." Maria's breathing slowed. The judge lifted a single page. "This mechanism originated from a direct system modification authorized under your executive login credentials." Ethan's heart pounded so loudly he thought the room might hear it. "It was within my authority," he said carefully. "Authority," Judge Langley replied, "does not exempt transparency." She placed the page down gently. "The timestamp associated with the modification predates any financial disclosure but occurred during the marriage and continued through the divorce filing." Maria felt the truth settle fully for the first time. This wasn't panic. It wasn't last-minute fear. It was deliberate, sustained. Judge Langley leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Caldwell, this was not precaution. It was strategy." The word echoed in the quiet courtroom. Ethan's shoulders sagged. He had always believed strategy meant intelligence. Now it sounded like intention. Maria stood without meaning to. "For 6 years?" she asked softly. Her voice wasn't angry. It was hollow. Ethan didn't answer. Judge Langley allowed the silence to stretch. "This court finds clear evidence of intentional asset manipulation," she said firmly. Richard stood quickly. "Your Honor, my client acknowledges errors in judgment, but there was no malicious intent. The timeline contradicts that assertion," the judge replied. She closed the fill. E. Accordingly, this court orders full redistribution of all concealed funds, including offshore holdings and diverted revenues. Maria felt her knees weaken. 700,000, plus offshore, plus transfers, everything. But Judge Langley wasn't finished. Additionally, she continued, due to the sustained nature of concealment, this court imposes punitive financial sanctions. Ethan's breath caught. "And this matter will be referred for further review under applicable statutes." The word hung in the air. Referred. The gavel struck. The sound didn't feel sharp. It felt final. Maria closed her eyes. It wasn't triumph she felt. It was release. 6 years of doubt had been answered in one moment. Ethan remained seated long after the courtroom began to empty. Richard leaned toward him quietly. "We can appeal," he said, but Ethan knew something Richard didn't. Appeal required arguing error. There was no error. There was evidence. As he stood, he noticed Maria watching him, not with hatred, not even with anger, just clarity. For the first time she wasn't unsure, and for the first time he wasn't in control. Outside the courthouse, the sky was overcast. Ethan paused on the steps. He had built layers upon layers of protection, accounts within accounts, entities within entities, justifications within justifications, all undone by a detail he assumed no one would notice. A timestamp. 3 minutes. That was all it took. Maria stepped past him without stopping. She didn't look back, because the story was no longer about what he hid. It was about what had finally been seen. The final ruling was delivered in writing 3 days later. There was no dramatic courtroom exchange this time. No raised voices, no gasps from the gallery, just a sealed document delivered through formal channels, stamped with the authority of the court and signed by Judge Rebecca Langley. Maria held the envelope in her hands for a long moment before opening it. Across town, Ethan had already received his copy. He had read it twice. The court's language was precise, clinical, and devastatingly clear. All concealed assets were to be returned to the marital estate. Full redistribution would reflect not just equitable division, but corrective adjustment. Punitive sanctions were confirmed, and the referral to financial authorities was officially entered into record. It wasn't just a divorce judgment, it was a reckoning. Maria unfolded the pages slowly, her eyes scanning each line. E numbers felt surreal. 700,000 in diverted revenue, 260,000 offshore. 500,000 routed through domestic layers, transfers, escalations, pathways. For years she had believed she was financially dependent. The truth was far more painful. She had been financially deceived. The ruling concluded with a statement that felt almost personal. The court finds that concealment, when sustained and deliberate, constitutes a breach of both legal and fiduciary duty within marriage. Transparency is not optional. It is foundational. Maria let the paper fall into her lap. Foundational. She had once believed their marriage had one. Ethan sat alone in his office, staring at the same sentence. He had built his identity around control of money, timing, structure, perception. He had believed that intelligence meant anticipating every move. What he hadn't anticipated was scrutiny, or consequence. His phone buzzed with a message from Richard. "We'll discuss next steps." There were no good next steps. Appeals would drag the process out, but the evidence wasn't ambiguous. The timestamp existed, the login existed, the pathways were documented. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. 6 years. 6 years of subtle adjustments. 6 years of believing that small manipulations wouldn't matter. And all of it unraveled because the court asked for records twice, not once. Twice. Maria met Daniel later that afternoon to finalize enforcement logistics. "You're entitled to immediate asset transfer," he explained. "The court's language leaves no room for delay." Maria nodded slowly. It wasn't victory she felt. It was something quieter. Stability. The kind that didn't depend on secrets. That evening she returned to the apartment that no longer felt temporary. She sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she once questioned her instincts and allowed herself to breathe. The fear that had lived inside her for years was gone. Not because the numbers were larger, but because the truth was no longer hidden. Ethan packed his office over the next week, not because he was bankrupt, but because the image he had maintained no longer fit. Investors distanced themselves. Partners asked questions. The referral triggered an inquiry he could no longer ignore. For the first time, the structures he built were being examined from the outside, without his narrative. One evening, he opened the archived vendor system where it had all begun. The modification screen looked harmless, just numbers, percentages, approval boxes, and in the corner, the timestamp, 3 minutes before midnight. He stared at it for a long time. It wasn't greed that had motivated him. It was fear. Fear of losing leverage, fear of vulnerability, fear of being equal. He shut the system down. Maria walked past the courthouse one last time the following month. She didn't stop. She didn't look up. She didn't need to. The building had done its job. It had asked the right question. The husband had shown fewer assets. The court had requested records again, and those records had told the story he never intended to reveal. In the end, it wasn't the offshore trust. It wasn't the LLC. It wasn't even the 700,000. It was the detail. The login, the timestamp, the evidence that turned a sue. Emption into proof. Everything had seemed under control, until the court asked for the numbers again.
From this story, we learn that when someone shows favor assets, They are not just hiding money, they are hiding their true intention, and intention cannot stay hidden forever. In life, being clear may work for some time. Numbers can be changed, records can be moved, but when the court asks for the records again, everything starts to come out. Every transfer, every entry, every small detail tells the truth. This story shows that real victory does not belong to the person who controls more money. Real victory belongs to the person who stands with the truth, because anything built on lies will fall on day, and sometimes it falls because of one small detail. So always remember, if you want to protect something in life, protect the truth. Money can come back, but once truth is broken, it is never fully the same again.